Hi, I'm Tony Allen Bernier, and in this video we're going to be doing a military patrol cap. There's two versions on the pattern. The one we're doing in the video is a shallower version. There's also going to be more of a standard depth version. And the plastic brim inserts I use, you can get those on my Etsy shop, or you can make your own using the template that's included in the pattern. And before we get started, I'd like to thank the Leather Crafters and Saddlers Journal for sponsoring my channel. The first thing you're going to do, you're going to cut these four parts out. You should mark the center when you're cutting them out, but if you don't do that, just mark them now before you start sewing this stuff together. Clip these corners a little bit. Now this is a thicker leather. Not sure if I'm going to do lining for this yet or not. So once you make sure you have all the centers marked, you're going to sew two of these on the short side and then sew the other two. After you get the centers marked, you're going to sew the two short sides together, and then you're going to do the other pair of these, and then we'll sew all four together. Make sure when you're doing your back stitches it hits right on top of the previous stitches. Otherwise, when you splay this out to do that French seam, it's going to fight you right on that edge. And before you peel the backing off, give these a press. You're not pulling this apart at all, you're just pressing it down, otherwise you're going to open those stitches up. Sometimes giving it a couple taps will help. I pick a spot on this presser foot to use as a guide so I can get my spacing just right. And my back stitches, I try to make sure they're past that 3/8 inch seam allowance that's going to come when I sew these to the other parts. That way you won't get those double stitches showing. If I was to just continue on back, some of that's going to show. Not that it's a huge deal. Just little things like that really help increase the professional looking quality of stuff. And instead of just moving this over to go on that side, I flip it around so I can use that exact same spot on the presser foot here. So once you have both of these done, you're going to flip one of them inside out and put the other one inside of there. But you're going to take where that center is marked and line it up with one of the seams on the other one. You don't want to put all the seams together, especially if you're doing it thick like this. It'll start to show and build up. So I'm going to do the other side here. So I'll just get those other ones lined up right in the center of the seam. And because an inside radius is always going to be shorter, I'll just hold this flat where I'm putting the clips for the time. I'll just hold it flat across where I'm putting the clips. And get some clips on here. Just rotate it around. can be a little tricky. Make sure you're keeping the back part from sliding underneath while you're sewing this. 3" seam allowance. Sometimes when you're going across multiple layers like this, you might have to slow down. Just make sure it hops up or the needle doesn't get kicked around at all. I like to make sure that needle's down in there when I manipulate the part around. See how it's kicking into that? So before I keep going, I'll lift the presser foot up so it grabs it, pulls it down. Try to finish right on top of those other stitches. That way when you fold these over and do the French seam, it goes together smoothly. Putting some basting tape on here to the outside, and then you can just flip this around and do this side. Here, once you fold these, you're going to need to tap all these seams a little bit. So what I'll do first is pull these out. Just to kind of get it to want to be in that shape. And then I'll also give these a fold just to get them started. And you can tell that that's going to be, with this thicker leather especially, that could be a little problematic. So I'm going to hit that a couple times with this mallet. Try to get that fold really worked in there. When you're tapping this, just make sure you don't go too hard. If you really start wailing on it, you're going to start ripping the stitches through the leather. What I'm going to do now, just go one side at a time and peel this back just a little bit. I'm just squeezing it together. I'm not pulling anything apart, and I skip every couple inches or so and then go back. That way that slack, if any, gets worked across evenly. Might need to really press where these seams are, make sure they stick down well. Now, sometimes I'll take this table off when I do these top stitches. Sometimes I'll leave it on. If you're looking to make a cap fully on a flatbed machine, check out my flat cap video. That'll show you how to manipulate like the bill and everything underneath there. It is possible, but there will be some steps that I pull this table off and use the cylinder arm just to simplify it a little bit. So first thing I'm going to do is look at what side of the cap looks the nicest. Which one of these seams looks the cleanest, because then I'll put that in front. That one looks pretty good. So I'll make that the front. So I will start on the back. So all my back stitches will be hidden in the back. Or you could start in the front and put a patch right over that section. Well, it's tricky. Sometimes this is going to get underneath there. So you really got to stop, make sure nothing's in the way. I'll usually have it flipped this way. When you get up to these extra seams, slow down, maybe even turn it by hand, especially when the leather's thick. This is going to want to kick that out. Sometimes you'll have to stop on those seams as well and lift the pressure foot up just to get it to hop up on there, right? Make sure that needle's in there when you manipulate the part around. You can see the back stitches are at the back of the cap. And what I like is to have a seam towards the bill on the front. So what I'll do is, this is the back of the cap. I'll put the front of the cap at the top here on the side that doesn't have that extra seam on it. So that way that seam will go right at the bill in the front of the cap. So you're going to clip that right on the center mark, and then the back of the cap where it's marked, you're going to clip that right on this center mark. Now you're going to use these other center marks, and it's not really true center because the top is kind of an egg shape, but you're going to put that right in the center of the side seams here. And then I just start picking this space off little by little. There's going to be just a little bit of easing on the main part, usually, unless your seam allowances are off, but if there is, just keep working that in as best you can. See, there's a little bit of slack on the back part, so I'll just kind of even that out across here as best I can. If you put the clips just a little bit higher, it's going to help this part seem to be bigger, so it'll line up a little better. And you can even put a seam right on the edge after you clip it like this, and then do your 3/8 inch seam. That first seam will really hold it down where you need it to be. Then after you do your second one, strip that top seam out. I like to take a look again before I move on to make sure both sides are even, because you can sometimes move around while you're putting the other clips on, getting it situated. So I'll do this side now, and we'll sew that on. So you're going to give that one more check just to make sure there's no folds. You can look on the inside too. If you see a fold that looks real bad, you can fix that up. But again, I'm going to check for the back side of the cap, and that's where I'm going to start. So these two layers might try to slide out of alignment a little bit, so all the extra clips can help. And this radius of this curve, that's the direction I'm pulling this excess in. If I just keep going like this down, eventually it's going to start making a fold that I'm going to have to deal with. So if I pull straight from that radius and then press this down so it's even across here when I stitch, it'll come out nice. Now you can do this step with the cylinder arm, but I like to do it on the flatbed because I feel like the slack that I'm pressing down helps ease that in just the tiniest bit more, which rounds that corner off just a little bit. Probably not a huge difference, just how I prefer to do it. Had trouble hopping up, so I went back one stitch so I can get that up on there. So you're putting the basting tape on here. You don't want to just pull it and put it on. I press my fingers underneath there so that part of the hat gets kind of pushed out. Otherwise you're going to bunch it up too much. And you see how if it's not lining up, I don't pull this. I let slack go into it and just let the tape fold. Once you peel that backing off, that tape's really thin, it's not going to show. And as always, really get those folds started before you pull that tape off of there. Make sure you get it stuck down real good with that basting tape. And on the inside, I pressed it down with the tip of my finger and went like every 3/4 of an inch and really tried to work it in. Otherwise you'll get a lot of folds. So I'll top stitch both sides of that. And again, I'm going to find the back, because since this goes around the top, we're going to have to do a back stitch. I might as well put that in the back with all the other ones. If it's straight across from there, everything will just look more uniform having them all in the back. Some of the back of that cap could get in the way a little bit. Might have to give it a couple folds to flatten it down. So I try not to pull on this one to separate them stitches. It probably doesn't make as much difference on the thicker leather here, but I try to just guide it through without pulling on one side or the other. This can sometimes catch on something too and all of a sudden pull stuff out of whack, so stop frequently and make sure nothing's snagged up anywhere. So with that little bit of easing on that side panel, you can see how that seam rides real nice right on top. So before we finish up the cap, we're going to need the brim sewn up here. And you can see one part is shorter than the other. It's smaller so that we can ease this fabric together, and that'll give us enough slack to wrap around the front of the brim insert. So we have a nice fold and a seam. So what I'll do first is get each corner clipped. And then find the center and just pull that forward. Get it evened up. I like to flip it over so the bigger piece is on top and you can see the slack a little bit better. Make sure it's the same on both sides. And then you're just going to pick this off one clip at a time. By going right in the center. Keep putting clips right in the middle. Even it out on each side. Throw a clip in there. I like to use a lot of clips when I'm doing any type of easing. It really helps hold everything in place. I'll do that to the other side, and then we're going to sew that seam, but it's not going to be a 3/8 inch seam. We're going to bring it in a little bit so we don't have as much slack in the seam allowance to fold underneath. You can already see how this kind of comes up and leaves a nice space for that plastic insert to rest. So instead of going to 3/8, I'll do like a 2/8 inch seam allowance. So I'll just ride on this groove right here because that's about a 2/8 inch seam allowance. We don't want to go that full 3/8 inch. See that this top piece here is the one with the slack in it, but after you flip it inside out, you'll still be able to tell which one is the longer piece because it sticks out past there. When you have this seam lined up, it's going to come out past the other one. So that one is what's going to wrap around to the short side. The smaller side is the side that the seam allowance is going to be on. So just fold it all over to the smaller side, and you're going to want about 3/4 to an inch on each side. I like to feel, make sure the seam allowance is all on the short side, and then start tightening this up. You're going to want that seam right on the edge. So I'll put a couple clips on. And then check the plastic and make sure there's the same amount of excess on each side. Make sure it's kind of stretched a little bit and you got the same amount of excess on each side. And when I stretch it, I like to grab this in my fingers and then press on the plastic with my thumb. You can stick a folder or something or a modeling spoon in there if you need to work that seam allowance. Sometimes it'll have a thick fold. You'll need to kind of spread that fold out a little bit. I start putting clips on the end, making sure that that's flush with the edge. And if you keep the clips back right on the seam allowance towards the edge there, you can use the clips to get rid of some of those folds underneath and you'll be able to sew through this without taking the clips off, unless you use a guide like I'm going to be using. So sometimes they'll want to come and fold over too much. You'll need to make sure you kind of stretch these just enough so that it's snug around the edge too. If you pull too much, you're going to start splaying those stitches open. And if it doesn't look like it wants to stay flat across the brim, you can grab a couple clips and just get them butted right up against the plastic. So you know when you sew across here, it's going to be nice and flat. So you can see right there I got a little bit of a wrinkle. So I'll just pull these just a little bit and get a clip right on the edge of that plastic to hold it. You can do this with the table on. I'm going to pop the table off and then get ready to sew these to the caps as well. When I'm setting up this guide, I like to pop a couple clips off. I like the first stitch line to be close to that seam allowance, but I don't like to go up on top of the edge. So I'll get relatively close. So whenever I start sewing my brims, I start right on the corner. This is all going to be hidden later on. That way it holds all these layers nice and tight when we get to that stage. And then I quickly have it meet up with that roller before I hit the plastic. I just got up onto the plastic, so I'll keep that pressure against the roller. This is another step where you really need to make sure that needle's down. You need to make sure that needle's down in there, otherwise you're going to lose that straight line. And these are actually the new plastic brim inserts I started making. I really like how they hold their shape. If you buy my plastic brim inserts, sometimes it's nice to have a little piece of scrap so you can test and get your tension dialed in for this as well. If you send me a message when you buy the brim inserts, I might have some scraps laying around I could send you so you have a couple pieces of that to practice on. Get your tension dialed in. As soon as I feel I get off the plastic a couple stitches, I'm going to move back towards this corner. First row. I'll put a second row in, maybe like 3/4 to an inch back. If you start getting too close and putting a lot in, it gets hard to keep them straight. So I'll just keep dialing this back until it looks good to me. Right there looks good. So this time I'll just butt it up to that guide and start off of the plastic. You can push to bunch this up on top of the brim, so make sure it's pulled snug, not stretching it, but pulled snug so you won't get any wrinkles on top. And sometimes this will want to kick up and ride on top of here, so I'll usually keep a finger right here just to make sure it stays down far enough to stay on that guide. Put the back stitches past the plastic. So next we got to get the brim insert on. And I'm going to find where the back is. And then this is the front. So it's going to go like that. I'll just eyeball it and grab the center and clip it down and then adjust it as necessary. And before I do that, I'm going to trim this to make sure it's exactly 3/8 inch from that plastic. And you can put a seam right here, especially if you're using thinner material. Put a seam right up next to the plastic before you try to put on the cap. It'll just help hold everything in place for you. Again, make sure you find the back, and if you marked it in under here, the front of the cap, so you can get this right where you need it to be. So if you trimmed it at 3/8 inch, you'll be able to just match those edges together. So I'll start by eyeballing it, get it as close as I can, put a few clips on, and then adjust it where necessary. And you can look at these side seams too to get an idea if you're off a little bit. That looks pretty much right on. And look at this center seam here. These stitches, you want this to be right dead center with that. I might need to come this way just a little bit. So you can see it's a little off here, so what I'll do is use my two fingers underneath and pinch it in between, and then use my thumb and other finger to kind of press that away. And you can grab it from underneath and get your clip back on there. So I'll show you here. If that's like that, I'll use my two middle fingers, pinch the body in between them, pull that back, and then pinch a fold underneath, holding it there, and get that clip back on there. And I'll go across, once I have it aligned, I'll go across and make sure I have all that situated. Once you have it centered, we're just going to sew that on there before we put the sweatband in there. It's easier to do it separately. So again, if you're looking to do this on a flatbed, I suggest watching my flat cap video. It'll show you how to manipulate these inserts and stuff underneath on a flatbed machine. So what I like to do though is grab this corner here and tack that down well. I'll go just off the edge with my back stitch. And then I'll have this part of my presser foot up on the plastic, but I make sure I'm close without hopping up onto it. And make sure your cap isn't folding underneath here, getting underneath the presser foot. I can use my fingernail to mark where that plastic is just lightly so I don't get up onto it. Stop and make sure nothing's folding up and getting under there. Make sure you don't get up onto that plastic. With all the thick layers there, it can be a little hard to tell exactly where it is. But that's going to come right to this edge. These stitches will be hidden. I'm going to hold that straight across. Don't pull it, don't stretch it. As soon as you get off of there, you want to go off and then back stitch back onto it. Help hold that corner down. Now I'm going to grab a piece of this sweatband material, and at the back of the cap I'm going to go just past that seam. So if this is the center of the cap in the back where we're going to want this to meet up, I'm going to come off of that at least a couple inches, line that up with the 3/8 inch seam allowance, and by being away from the back, that way it'll give us enough slack to sew these ends together and manipulate anything else we need to do. So I just make sure it goes past that center mark on the back. Place this under here. That's got to be on the 3/8 inch seam allowance, and it'll just nick this edge. And about halfway across this is a 3/8 inch. So I can look underneath and line it up right with the center. Make sure that needle's down, and before you get to the brim here, you're going to want to kind of maybe bend it a little in reverse so this can lay how you need it to. And I'm going to be looking at where this needs to come up, because this will ride right up against the plastic there. That way, by stopping back, we can get it nice straight instead of going and then all of a sudden having to move where this is placed. With a thicker leather, it's a little bit harder to find that plastic under there. So it's going to be hard to get this to pop back up on here. So I'll lift up the pressure foot as I'm going, maybe turn it by hand a little. So here's right where it needs to pop up onto here. See, I'm like half depressing that pressure foot so it doesn't have to just hop up all of a sudden. And once you're up on there, and I'm holding that butted up against the plastic, make sure nothing's underneath here. Butt that up against the plastic and hit right on that edge. Again, make sure nothing's folding underneath there. Since I'm coming off the cap again, I'm going to make sure it's lined right up in the center. Okay, so I had a little bit of issue. It was popping off because it's so thick right here. It was hard to stay up against the plastic, so I put a couple clips on there. I stripped it back, put a couple clips on there to remind me exactly where that plastic edge is. That way this will get hidden under there. And again, make sure that goes right dead center. And before you get to the back here, you're going to want to stop short. Now at this point you have a couple options. You can just seam them together, so it's like you can just seam these ends together right at the back, so it's just a fitted cap. Or if you made the cap just a little bit bigger than you'll need, and I show in my short brim cap video how to adjust this so you can make a perfect fit while still looking like a fitted cap. So check out the end of that video. That's my short brim cap video. So what I'll do is trim this 3/8 inch, well, maybe a little closer, 2/8, because you want just a tiny bit of stretch in this, otherwise it'll bunch up when you go across here. Okay, so I cut it just a little bit past that, so I have enough for a seam there, and the seam is going to be, the seam allowance is going to be in towards the cap, so you'll go that way and then flip it so you can get it sewn here. So right here is just the size of the cap itself, and I may need that to be a little bit snugger because you want just a little bit of a stretch so it sews across there smoothly. But at this point what you can do is have the person try it on, flip this in, try it on before you finish that stitch across here. Flip this over, try it on, and you would have made this cap just a little bit bigger than you need. So then what you can do is add a stitch right here, a little bit in, and strip those until you get the fit just right, clip off the excess, and then sew across here. So it's like a one-size-fits-all kind of, while still looking like a nice fitted cap. Alright, I added a stitch closer, and then I stripped the back one out. You might want to tap that with a lighter so it doesn't fray. But you can see I have to have a little bit of a stretch for it to get to that size. But that's what I want. So now what you're going to do is just stretch this out till it gets to the length of the cap, and then I'll pinch it like halfway so I'm not fighting the whole thing all at once. And you're going to pull on the back too so it stretches it out. You're not pulling it through, you're just letting the sewing machine guide. So you can see it gives just a little bit of a bunching in the back, but while you're wearing it, it's going to look like a nice fitted cap.